Welcome to Hot Springs Village Inside Out, a weekly podcast where Hot Springs Village, Arkansas is the star. Join me, Randy Cantrell, and my co-host Dennis Simpson as we discuss the history, facts, people, places, events, lots more surrounding Hot Springs Village, Arkansas. Visit the website at hotspringsvillageinsideout.com. Good morning. Today is Saturday, October the 16th, 2021. This is a commentary. I'll entitle this, Born in a Small Town, Grew Up in Big Towns, and Now I Crave Growing Older in Hot Springs Village. It's a long title. Let me make a note, perhaps a disclaimer. Hot Springs Village, Arkansas isn't a town at all. I am using the term town in the most general sense possible. I am not using it in the technical municipality or incorporated sense. My name is Randy Cantrell. Dennis and I joke that Hot Springs Village Inside Out is him being inside, me being outside. And that's not exactly why we titled the show the way we did. In fact, Inside Out means that there's some awesomeness inside the village, and there is some awesomeness, a lot of awesomeness, outside the village as well. Truth is, there's quite a bit of awesomeness in the entire state of Arkansas, and I am saying that as a guy who, well, prior to our visit to Hot Springs Village in 2018, I had not spent a whole lot of time in the state of Arkansas. I was born in Ada, Oklahoma, a place now most known for being the birthplace of Blake Shelton. Yes, NBC's The Voice and country music star. That's an event that happened long after I had moved away. Both sets of grandparents lived in Ada. My parents were from there. My family left shortly after I began the third grade. And so my earliest years experienced small town America, but after that, city life was really the way I grew up, except when I visited grandparents. You know, I could never quite relate to friends who lived in the country. I mean, even in those early years in living in Ada, we weren't living in the country. It was small town. And I know there are variations of where people live. There is rural America, agriculturally based America. There's small town America. There's city America, and there's huge variations of all those. I live right now in Dallas-Fort Worth and have for over 30 years. Not the same as being in New York City, though. It's a big city, but it ain't New York City. It's not LA. And living near downtown Dallas is a very different experience than where I have lived for 30 years. It's just not the same. So I realize that experiences are very, very different in any of these categories that we call home. Rhonda and I spent a week in Hot Springs Village about a week ago, and while I was there, I had this epiphany. Yeah, maybe that's too strong of a word. I jokingly will tell friends I am just a man in search of an epiphany, and occasionally, like a blind pig, I find one every now and again. Maybe it was just a feeling, maybe it was an insight, maybe it wasn't an epiphany at all, but it was something that I'd never felt before. I mean, never felt before. I looked at Rhonda on our first full day there. It was a Monday. We had just returned from Melinda's, getting a breakfast taco, and I had met Alana Owen. And I said to Rhonda, you know, I get the value of living in a small town where you know lots of folks and where lots of folks know you. And it was absolutely precipitated by the fact that I walked in the door having never met Alana except through having her on our program. And there she is in the back of the place, baseball cap, apron, working as entrepreneurs do. And she hollered out my name. I never met this woman before in my life except online. You know, the truth, I didn't learn any of this until starting this podcast. And I've been podcasting for 20 years. But how could I have known? I've lived most of my life, in fact, I've lived all of my adult life in cities. Places like Baton Rouge and Oklahoma City and DFW. I did grow up an avid fan of the Andy Griffith Show. In fact, when the VCR was invented and it entered the scenes in about the mid-1970s, my first batch of blank video tapes, VHS tapes, I used it to capture every episode of Andy Griffith, which was broadcast at the time pretty regularly on TBS. So much so that I collected every episode. I read books about the place. I knew Mayberry really, really well. I was a big fan. I did have some concept as a little boy in Ada of what Mayberry or small town America might be like. I mean, you know, Christmas parades down Main Street. I remember. The businesses on Main Street painting their glass windows to cheer on the Ada High Cougars football team. There was JD's Cafe where my grandfather and the other old heads of the day would gather in the morning. Bob's Barbecue, that was famous. The Huddle drive-in and dine-in restaurant. My grandmother loved their burgers. Hollering at the TV as we all watched Bud Wilkinson's OU Sooners. Yes, I'm still a Sooner fan. So I had enough taste. I had enough taste during those early years to at least have some sense of what it was to live in a small town. But what I missed was the scope of knowing people and being known by people. You know, that old everybody knows everybody feeling it's not a feeling you experience as a kid. But I'm beginning, now mind you, I'm just beginning to know the feeling thanks to this podcast and all the fine folks that I have met inside Hot Springs Village. We recorded a show with Mike Nicolosi just this week. It'll come out the first Friday of November, so make sure that you catch that. Mike's not a shy guy, but like me, he's just more comfortable being kind of back in the shadows. An introvert that looks like an extrovert. And during our conversation, he said that Clara, his wife, and also the head of Remax of Hot Springs Village, he said, Clara dragged me to the village years ago, and I didn't want to come here. But within 5 minutes, he said I didn't want to leave. And when we asked him why, his simple response was the people. The people. Everybody was friendly. I hear this over and over and over and over and over again every time that we have somebody on and we find out about their story of coming to the village. People from Houston like Mike, people from DFW like Greg Jones, people from all over who somehow have found their way to Hot Springs Village, Arkansas. And they all remark about two things: the beauty, the magnificent beauty of the place, and the friendliness of the people. And come on, no wonder people who arrive don't want to leave. Why would you? This past trip, our super host on Airbnb, they are repeat hosts for us, by the way. They happen to have one of our favorite spots. It's a lovely bedroom suite in the basement of their home on a golf course inside the village. And Rhonda and I, neither one golf, but I love being on a golf course. So we sit on this covered patio at the back of this house, sitting in these white wicker rockers, watching the golfers, watching the chipmunks, watching the squirrels, the deer. Hawks are overhead, soaring in the wind, effortless, navigating the winds. There's no hum of distant traffic. There is no glow of city nights as the sun fades. It's quiet. It's tranquil. It's peaceful. I just liken it to a big exhale. So Rhonda and I, we walk. We go to an area of the village where another favorite Airbnb superhost lives. He's the only house within a mile or more. Secluded part of the village where we just walk these streets, passing acreage that's never been built on. Secluded. Trees, rocks, wildlife, creeks. Wind rustling through the trees. You know, as Dennis is fond of kind of mocking me, quoting me, it's pretty stinking awesome. It is pretty stinking awesome. And that could easily be another tagline to our podcast. Not about our podcast, but about Hot Springs Village. It is pretty stinking awesome. There's nothing small town about that. Nor is it rural, which for a guy like me means there's cattle and crops. Hot Springs Village, Arkansas is very much like living in a national park. It's a community in the midst of a national park-like beauty, tranquil, serene, secure, safe, peaceful, priceless. I'm not yet a resident inside the village, but I've made so many friends that I feel like I'm a citizen there. I'm part of the community that so loves this place. And people who share the same feelings that I do about the place, people who describe how they feel when they drive through those gates exactly the way I describe it. I've heard it over and over and over again, and we all say the same thing. It's just like a big exhale. Our Airbnb hosts on this trip, they're typical folks inside the city. These are people that we met a few years ago when we first rented their suite. They arrived from a very nice community on the East Coast, another POA kind of an experience. Folks who were attracted to kind of get back to their Midwestern roots and values. People who love to golf and love getting to know the people who rent their space. So we visit with them quite a lot when we're there. Sometimes we visit neighbors as well. Oh, I see you guys are from Texas. Whereabouts? It's a pretty common conversation that we have. Most every time we stay inside the village, they'll notice our Texas plates and they'll make inquiry, and yeah, people are friendly. We have always found that to be the case. Are people in all small towns friendly? I'm not naive enough to believe that. I mean, come on. I have watched Virgin River. It's not who you know that matters, it's who knows you that's important. I've known that, but not really known that. And I have known this feeling in smaller industry circles. I mean, when you spend years in an industry, you sort of get to know the people in the space, and some people get to know you, but that's different. Living in a place where that's the case, well, that's not something I have ever known. I know a few folks up and down the street. I live in a perfectly lovely community and on a street that I frankly love. Old established neighborhood, big trees, oversized lots. I don't live in one of those zero lot line kind of places. I know a few people. I don't know them all. And the few people that I do know, I'm not going to tell you that I know them well, because I don't. It's just how life rolls in the big city. And I'm not complaining, I'm just making an observation. I suspect that it seems to me that it's probably a cultural expectation that comes with living in a city. You give people space. You expect people to give you space. The irony is, the bigger the crowd, the more isolated people become. It's funny how that works. A crowd of strangers, an even bigger crowd of bigger strangers, an occasional wave, probably not much more. Nothing wrong with that. It's just different. The journey began when I sent Dennis an email, and it was an email that he never saw coming, from a guy who had rented his guest bedroom suite on Lake DeSoto in October of 2018, my very first foray into the village. But a guy that he hadn't heard from since, complete stranger, with what could have been perceived as a harebrained idea to start a podcast about Hot Springs Village. And after weeks and weeks of trying to make contact, we finally are able to get on a Zoom call for the very first time. I didn't have a clock on it, but I'm going to guess within 2 minutes, Dennis said, "Yes, I'm in." And he kept repeating it, "I'm in, I'm in." And that would be a telling indicator to me of how this guy rolls. I love him for his speed to jump on an opportunity to put Hot Springs Village forward. And it began this whirlwind of interactions as we grew to learn each other and, more importantly, to trust one another. Dennis, the boy who grew up in Arkansas, Central Arkansas. Me, the boy who grew up in cities. Dennis, the fearless extrovert. Me, the more reserved introvert. But along the way, we quickly discovered a lot more joined us than separated us. In fact, a lot more than we possibly could have imagined coming into this thing. And along the way, I was learning unintentionally the power of community, the power of small town living, where everybody knows your name. Okay, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people know your name. And where you know more names after a few months than you know about, well, people in the town that you've lived in for 30 years. I was and am truly amazed. And I rather liked it. You know, the process of meeting all the terrific guests who have been on this podcast, these people willing to share their stories, to have heartfelt conversations about how they got to Hot Springs Village and why they love the place so much. Early on, in fact, it was mere weeks after we had launched the show, I began to think, so this may be what small town looks like. This may be what small town feels like. But how do I know? Didn't have any frame of reference except for my earliest days. I was in Mrs. Arnold's first grade class at Hayes Elementary School in Ada, Oklahoma on November 22nd, 1963. When news arrived from the town where I now live, Dallas-Fort Worth. President Kennedy had been shot. He was dead. I remember we all gathered along the second floor windows of our classroom, which looked out over the front of the school where the flagpole was, and we watched as they lowered that flag to half-mast. Yeah, those things stay with you. Doesn't matter how old you get. An old schoolhouse, an assassination that drops a country, maybe a world, to its knees. Is that small town, or is that just life in 1963? Probably a little both. I really don't know. We just know what we know, right? We just know our experience. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong. It just is what it is. But it all makes me wonder about life in a small town. being in a place where you know a lot of folks and a lot of folks know you. I do not claim to fully know or understand the power of all this because, well, I'm just starting to taste it. I got to confess, I like it quite a lot. Knowing the story of others, there's a reward in that. Understanding their story, that's for me the most powerful thing. We live in a world where it's so easy to make snap judgments without any context, without any knowledge, without any understanding, and I find it remarkably satisfying to learn and to know. So my curiosity continues to grow along with my age and a wrinkle or two. So I click play. I've embedded it in the show notes. I click play for the umpteenth time on this John Mellencamp song, Small Town. You know the song. And those pictures that John used in that music video, they're not pictures of me. They're not pictures of anybody I know other than a young John Cougar Mellencamp. But they speak to me. They don't represent my life after third grade, but I can imagine. And today, thanks to the warm welcome that Dennis and I have received as a result of our little show, Hot Springs Village Inside Out, I'm learning the high benefit of being part of a small town. One of the most beautiful small towns on the planet. So thank you, one and all. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hot Springs Village Inside Out, a podcast where Hot Springs Village, Arkansas is the star. Please subscribe to the podcast. You can do that by visiting our website, hsvinsideout.com, and tell a friend.